So I'm going to talk about my experience of becoming a marine geoarchaeologist, as I say, after many years as a purely terrestrial geoarchaeologist, so 18 years in fact, and only the last 2 doing marine. I guess ideally in the hope that I can encourage anyone who is either new to marine geoarchaeology or thinking about developing their skills in that area, and hopefully signpost some resources. I guess the main reason I wanted to talk about this is because we've got a real skills shortage when it comes to marine geoarchaeologists. So I hope I can show you that it can be done, and perhaps ease the path into marine geoarchaeology. I chose diving in at the deep end as part of the title, not only because it is obviously a hilarious pun, but also because it is certainly what it felt like initially, given the different approaches to marine geoarchaeology and sort of different ways of gathering data. But I think as a little with some guidance, I think it can be more of a sort of slowly ease yourself into at the shallow end. So I do hope I can contribute to that. My experience that I'm going to talk about today is mainly from the perspective of marine geoarchaeology in industry and how it relates to marine planning, which Vic will sort of take forward as well. But I think a lot of it is relevant to research, and you'll see later on how embedded academic research is and how we approach submerged landscapes particularly. So if anyone in the call is more involved in research, obviously I welcome your perspectives as well, and there should be some time for sort of discussion at the end on that. So I'm going to talk about why marine geoarchaeology matters, why do we do it, why it's relevant to submerged landscapes and paleolandscape features. I'll talk about some of the key methods that we apply in marine geoarchaeology and how they relate to a staged approach to assessment. I'll signpost some useful guidance and resources, and then I'll end with some challenges and sort of points for discussion, which we can hopefully run through as a group. So in terms of why marine geoarchaeology matters, so like geoarchaeology as a whole, it's a multidisciplinary approach that combines geology, geophysics, geomorphology, sedimentology, stratigraphy, palaeoenvironmental science, and archaeology. So it really is a multidisciplinary approach. It helps us to understand submerged landscapes that are now lost to the sea, and enables us to identify and investigate paleolandscape features such as rivers, wetlands, and coastlines, which would, for a period of time prior to sea level rise, have been as much a part of the prehistoric human story as any environment on land. So an understanding of these landscapes through geoarchaeological approaches helps us to identify where submerged archaeology might be and how best to investigate it. It enables us to investigate and protect deposits associated with buried landscapes, and it reduces the risk of the important features of those landscapes being damaged during development of the seabed. Given that cultural heritage, and as part of that, marine geoarchaeology is embedded within the planning process, our assessments support offshore development by informing heritage assessments and method statements, particularly those related to the assessment of geotechnical and geophysical data collected for engineering purposes. So the seabed is being developed faster now than ever before, and the density of development is really striking and not something that I was at all aware of before I started working more regularly on marine projects. And you can see that in the Crown Estate Open Data Portal. That's a good place to start. This map on the left, and that sort of shows the sheer volume of developments related to renewable energy that are going forward at the moment, as well as aggregate dredging, coastal defence projects such as beach replenishment, carbon capture, and also previous infrastructure related to oil and gas. The seabed, particularly in the North Sea, shown there, is really busy place. So with marine cultural heritage embedded within planning policy and legislation, marine geoarchaeology can help to avoid or mitigate impacts from these developments on the seabed. So I'd say as marine geoarchaeologists, we've got a really vital role to play in that process. So I wanted to include this slide as a demonstration of where certainly my thinking was at as a purely terrestrial geoarchaeologist. I guess when I came out of my quaternary science masters, and I suppose arguably where academic thinking was only a couple of decades ago, before the publication of Bryony Coles's paper on Dogland in I think 1998, and then obviously developed in the research projects that followed that. More on those later. Before then, we had no real understanding at all of the submerged landscapes that were present around the UK and what the real potential was for the cultural heritage of those areas. The BGS mapping of superficial geology in the onshore geoindex, which is shown here, I guess understandably stops at the coastline, and I think that sort of tallied with the extent of my knowledge of deposits up to a couple of years ago. But things have moved on, and we now know that since the end of the last ice age and since about 20,000 years ago, global sea level rise has been around 120 to 130 meters, and a pretty remarkable statistics that I heard fairly recently from the team at Bradford, the Submerged Landscapes Research Centre, is that globally sea level rise since then has resulted in around 20 to 25 million square kilometres of land, which is equivalent to the combined size of the US and Canada being lost to the sea by around 6,000 years ago. And that's the areas shown in red on the figure in the top right of this slide. And that, of course, includes Doggerland, which is this vast area of submerged landscapes in the North Sea and the English Channel, which once connected us to mainland Europe. In some of the most recent outputs related to the research projects at Bradford, what this means for cultural heritage is expressed really nicely as the Goldilocks zone, where specific requirements need to be met for a likelihood of finding prehistoric archaeology. And arguably, as marine geoarchaeologists, we're responsible for the bottom two requirements, which is assessing whether landscape features that could preserve archaeology are present, whether they're detectable and accessible, and also assessing whether the depositional and post-deposition environments associated with those features are conducive to preservation of both archaeology and paleoenvironmental remains. So in terms of what we look for as marine geoarchaeologists, there are a number of different types of deposits that can be attributed to submerged landscape features in the same way that they would be on land. In terms of their associated archaeological and paleoenvironmental potential, they can therefore be treated in the same way in terms of assessing their overall geoarchaeological potential. And apart from being a bit more compressed, the deposits are fundamentally the same as those on land, but the real difference in a marine context is the access that we have to those deposits and the way about the deposits that data is gathered. So using peat as an example, though obviously there are other interesting deposits in the North Sea, we know that late Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic peats do survive either within paleolandscape features or as isolated outcrops. And where we have peat, we have vegetation, we have animals, and we may have people. And that's the same for some of the other deposits associated with terrestrial features. So the staged approach to geoarchaeological assessment in a marine context is very similar to the one adopted on land, with 5 stages that usually begin with a review of geotechnical data, recording of samples, paleoenvironmental assessment and analysis, and then obviously publication where the results warrant it. The key difference in the approach to assessment offshore is at stages 1 and 2, where we're so much more reliant on both geotechnical data and samples that have been obtained for engineering purposes. So like on land, stage 1 will typically involve a review of geotechnical logs related to geotechnical surveys that have been undertaken for engineering purposes associated with development. And this data is fundamental for initial assessment of geoarchaeological potential. And yet the important thing to remember is that the logs are described using geotechnical parameters and terminology, which can be very different to ours. Obviously, in a marine context, this is often the only direct data on sedimentology that we have to work with. The results can be compared with geophysical data, which I'll come back to in a moment. A project will usually progress to stage 2 geoarchaeological recording, which is dependent on the availability of samples and the approach to sampling for archaeological purposes. And this is where things really differ from on land, because where a borehole survey might be undertaken at this stage for geoarchaeology, in most cases that isn't an option offshore, or rather it can be, but it can be a very, very expensive one. So something that became very clear to me when I started doing marine geoarchaeology is how fundamental geophysical survey is, and how important paleolandscape assessment of that data can be. So like geotechnical data, geophysical survey is usually undertaken for engineering purposes, and it's made available for archaeological assessment for things like seabed wrecks and other features, but also submerged landscapes, which might include things like channels and their estuaries, paleo coastlines, and evidence for peat and other sediments related to terrestrial landscapes. So in many ways, this is the equivalent of LiDAR on land, and don't worry, I haven't forgotten about terrestrial geophysics. But as a first assessment of where paleolandscape features might be, where we might find deposits of high archaeological and paleoenvironmental potential, and what the overall landscape context is for deposits that are recovered during a geotechnical survey. So it's a really fundamental information for marine geoarchaeologists. So when it comes to geotechnical surveys undertaken for engineering, these are usually in the form of vibrocores, boreholes, or cone penetration tests, CPTs. Vibrocores, which are a bit like the marine equivalent of window samples on land, for anyone familiar with those. They tend to be shallow, generally less than about 6 meters below seabed, but they do retain a continuous sequence of samples in sleeved liners, which can be really valuable if we can get our hands on them for geoarchaeological recording and obviously paleoenvironmental assessment as the project moves forward. The approach to boreholes varies offshore in terms of the drilling and sampling methodology, but the rate of sampling tends to vary. The samples don't tend to be continuous, and samples often end up in bags, which is an issue I'll come back to later. But that they are deep, often to 60 meters below seabed or more, so they can be really useful for determining the stratigraphy of the deposits to a much greater depth based on geotechnical log reviews. Cone penetration tests don't produce samples, but their information on the density and stiffness of a deposit can be helpful as an initial indication of which stratigraphic unit deposits belong to. For example, softer clays of an alluvial sequence, or stiff clays of a glacial diamict. So a number of approaches form part of or support geoarchaeological assessment in a marine context, and most of these will be very familiar to geoarchaeologists working on land and approached in a very similar way. Sedimentology, as it is on land, is really key for establishing environment of deposition and associated archaeological and preservation potential. Stratigraphy and deposit modelling are key for placing deposits in both their local and wider regional context, particularly with reference to existing lithostratigraphic frameworks. Along with paleolandscape data from geophysical assessments, the offshore regional lithostratigraphic frameworks, of which there are many around the UK, are particularly useful in a marine context because they provide something that geotechnical descriptions of deposits can be paired against and correlated to. Geochronology and paleoenvironmental reconstruction are as important as they are onshore and enable us to assess the age and environment of deposition of a deposit in more detail. And the requirement for further investigation, also the approach to that investigation, are therefore informed by a number of different considerations, each of which will inform the overall assessment of geoarchaeological potential. And credit to ChatGPT for this figure. I did feed it with lots of information. I think it's done a fairly good job. But yeah, anybody familiar with AI creation of flowcharts and diagrams will recognize that is produced by ChatGPT. So yeah, so these next few slides are intended to signpost some hopefully really useful resources for geoarchaeologists working in a marine context. I'll make sure these slides are all available after the talk, so you can refer back to them. These are the resources that I found the most useful. There will be others. It's not an exhaustive list, but it took me some time to accumulate these. So if I can speed up the process for you, that'll mean I've achieved something positive. So in terms of guidance documents with information that's sort of directly relevant to geoarchaeology, I've listed some of the key ones here, and some of them are more tailored to cultural heritage assessment, but they include approaches to geoarchaeology, reference to relevant to different types of development like offshore wind and ports and harbours. Some of them lay out best practice approaches to geoarchaeology, which can be helpful when placing geoarchaeological assessment in its wider context related to the planning process, and in some cases justifying the work that we are doing or recommending. In terms of digital data, and by that I mean sort of georeference data sets as layers or shapefiles, which can be pulled into QGIS or ArcGIS, whichever one you use. There are several sources of data which can provide a really useful baseline assessment of the type of deposits that you might expect to see in any given offshore location. For baseline bathymetry data with pretty good, albeit low resolution coverage of the seabed, the eModNet website is particularly useful. And they've also got shapefiles for submerged landscapes linked to a few different research projects as well. So that's a really good place to start. Something I use occasionally, and probably not enough, is the Marine Data Exchange. That's got a number of geotechnical and geophysical data sets and reports, as well as some archaeology focused reports as well. The Crown Estate Open Data Portal, which one I mentioned earlier, that's most useful for shapefiles showing marine development rather than data sets, but it can be a really useful starting point to work out how your site sits in relation to others and which sites might have data relevant to your project. So another good starting point as well. The ADS website, like it does on land, hosts a number of outputs from marine research projects, including shapefiles, so definitely worth a look. The BGS GeoIndex is always useful. In terms of mapping of deposits, it doesn't compare to the level of detail in the onshore equivalent, understandably, but it does signpost towards things like the offshore regional reports and the 1 in 250K map descriptions, which are on the BGS text viewer. And they've recently added the 1 in 250K mapping of quaternary deposits as well. So that's really, as a downloadable shapefile. So that's a really useful resource. For archaeological context, there are others, but the Unpathed Waters data portal is really helpful, as well as everything's georeferenced and accessed via an online map. There's some other really useful resources, including the outputs from the regional environmental characterizations, which were funded by the Marine Aggregates Levy Sustainability Fund. Some of those include shapefiles, which you can download for your GIS as well, and they're all accessible online. Academic publications are as useful offshore as they are onshore, particularly for some well-studied areas like Dogger Bank and other parts of the North Sea. So always useful, so Google search or ask your AI assistant. Research frameworks and their resource assessments are always useful for geoarchaeological background and archaeological context, and also for linking research themes to any recommendations that you make for further geoarchaeological or palaeoenvironmental assessment. And I've added the links to all of those here, so hopefully they'll work when I share the PDF later. And then there's research projects and the outputs from those, of which there have been many over the years, and a few of the key ones are listed here. Too many to fit on one slide, obviously, but I've included some of the key ones with links. It's obvious how much work has come out of the University of Birmingham and Bradford, thanks to Vince Gaffney. A lot of the projects are focused on mapping of submerged landscape features using geophysical data, but lots of them do have sort of ground truthing of deposits using boreholes as well. And the most recent project, which is Sub Nordica, that's focused on using the data on the submerged landscape to identify zones of high archaeological potential supported by AI sort of processes. So some really exciting developments associated with that one, particularly when it comes to the consideration of archaeological prospection, which is something we'll chat about later. So to finish off, I just wanted to highlight a few challenges or points for discussion, which you can see here. And some of these are relevant to Vic's talk, which we'll be giving in a moment. So perhaps, yeah, as I said, sort of open them up to discussion at the end of both talks, but I'll run through them briefly now and offer some of my own perspectives. Arguably the most pressing issue, as I highlighted earlier, is a skills shortage. We've got too few people doing marine geoarchaeology, so we need to make sure that adequate training and resources are in place to make sure there's enough marine geoarchaeologists, and to make sure that things are being done to an appropriate standard as well. So the question is, how best do we address that? This network obviously is a good place to start to try and answer that question, and it links quite nicely back to the questionnaire responses, which Rob highlighted earlier, which highlighted the requirement for training in geoarchaeology and palaeoenvironmental specialisms. Something that we've had an issue with during recent geotechnical work is the loss of samples to geotechnical testing. Not necessarily because of the amount of geotechnical testing, but because material has been taken out of core samples, put in bags, and obviously therefore losing that stratigraphic context and limiting what we can do with them. So that's obviously something we've experienced at Haskoning, but I'll be interested to know if other people have had a similar problem, and if they've found out a clever way of trying to fix it. We're at a point where we're developing a poster for geotechnical contractors, which explains why removing samples from core liners is important. But yeah, welcome any thoughts on that. The approaches to archaeological mitigation in an offshore context are obviously complicated by the depth of the seabed, but there is a bit of a drive at the moment towards evaluation of the seabed for archaeology by either divers or where it's shallow enough, grab samples. And the work that we do as marine geoarchaeologists is really important for telling people where to look for archaeology. So with that in mind, something that we've had various discussions about is what our end product is as geoarchaeologists, and what does this mean for archaeological prospection of the seabed? Are we producing information that is useful to archaeologists, for example, and where are we heading with that? And that will be something that Vic is going to touch on in a moment. And finally, just something I want to flag is that based on all the information and guidance and resources that I've shared in this talk, I wanted to ask the question of the group is do we need a guidance document tailored just to marine geoarchaeology? I guess equivalent to the geoarchaeology guidance that already exists that Historic England have produced. Do we need something that has a focus on marine geoarchaeology? Okay, well, I'm going to stop there because my voice is starting to go, and I think I will hand over to Vic, and we will save discussion for the end if that's okay with everybody. I will stop sharing and let you take over. Thank you, everybody.
We can find the stop sharing button. That person I am.
I've done it. There you go.
Well done.
I did it quicker than you did earlier, Vic.
Did. Right, let's see if this now works. You should hopefully get to see my slides now. There we go. Got it. Brilliant. So I don't have a snappy title for my presentation because apparently calling it "Isn't It Just Mud" wouldn't have gone down well with the first network event. So I wasn't allowed to call it that. So we are going to focus in this presentation on the role of marine geoarchaeology in EIA. So this is basically, it's kind of, what is the point? What is it all for? Obviously, as geoarchaeologists, you understand how, there is a point to geoarchaeology. I don't mean that in a dismissive way, but I mean, from my point of view as a marine heritage consultant, as a marine archaeologist, I'm looking at it in a slightly different way. So it's how do all of these aspects work together to kind of come together in providing kind of mitigation and impact assessments. I can change my slides as well. So as a starting point, this map, which was produced for the Taking at the Flood project, I think is a really good indicator, which shows that we know that there's submerged landscapes out there. We know that people were present, but when you actually look at the distribution of Paleolithic and Mesolithic sites and find spots that have been encountered over the years, you can see that we really aren't finding these offshore. So effectively, where are they? We've known how to look for them for quite a long time, or we've had ideas about how to look for them, but we're not finding the archaeology. So how are we working with geoarchaeology and geophysics to kind of actually find the archaeology offshore? Wessex Archaeology undertook very important project back 2003 to 2007 called the Seabed Prehistory Project. This was funded through the Aggregate Levy Sustainability Fund, and effectively the whole premise of the project was to look at how we can take geophysical survey data, vibrocore survey and geoarchaeological assessment, and then granted through thing with grab samples to kind of, sort of see how we might investigate and find these sites offshore. So this was 20 years ago that we first started looking at this. There was some success. There were flints found in the grab samples, but I think it was kind of seen that the returns on time, whether or not these were archaeological artifacts or whether or not they were, you know, just natural flints, but it was difficult to tell. So we kind of sort of almost dropped doing grab samples from our suite of kind of mitigation. But the key outcomes of this project, and this is what was really important, was it demonstrated without doubt that the archaeological resource exists within submerged paleolandscapes. We can reconstruct these landscapes with fairly high confidence, but the existing EIA data collection was not really doing the job that it was supposed to do. So it came out with kind of some key recommendations that were all focused around this multidisciplinary approach, which means we combine doing targeted geophysical survey, we combine doing coring activities which are directed by the outcomes of the geophysical surveys, and that we're undertaking geoarchaeological assessment and paleoenvironmental analysis, and that this all feeds into digital terrain and paleolandscape modelling to help us try and find the people. So this was all kind of in the early years in 2003 to 2007, and we should probably bear in mind that Historic England didn't have a remit over the marine environment until 2002. So we're talking the very early days of us starting to do marine archaeology as part of a wider kind of planning system. And this is a good way of looking at it, I think, is to look at kind of EIAs for offshore wind farms over the years and how these have kind of changed. Now, this EIA is actually a really awesome approach, but in 2006, the assessment done for the Links offshore wind farm was 52 pages long. The whole of the assessment done for marine archaeology for the wind farm was 52 pages long. This wind farm is 8 kilometres off the Lincolnshire coast. And at that time, in 2006, the only planning guidance and the only kind of methodologies that we had to work from were the same as the onshore. It was PPG 16 back in those days. We were using geophysical data that was still only available on paper rolls. There was some digital, but largely the geophysical data was only on paper rolls. There was no geotechnical surveys undertaken, no boreholes, no vibrocores to inform EIA. And in this EIA, 6 of the pages were just on seabed prehistory, which I've put a little smiley face there because this is actually pretty good. This is actually quite a big proportion of this chapter that was actually given over to seabed prehistory. But it kind of shows us that back in this kind of time, we were really establishing this awareness of how important this was to be assessed at the EIA stages. But at that time, really, the focus was very much on what we knew from the desk-based information. So we're talking about glaciation and sea level change. We're talking about topography, how climate would have changed. And we're using what we know from onshore to extrapolate offshore to see kind of what that potential might be. Again, bearing in mind that we're only 8 kilometres off the coast here. But then in the subsequent years after this, pretty soon after that, we have a series of legislation and planning guidance which kind of changed everything. So we have the EIA, the Marine Works regulations come into force in 2007. So we start having EIA for marine archaeology appearing much more regularly in the assessments that are being done offshore. In 2009, we had the Marine and Coastal Access Act, which set up the Marine Management Organisation as the Marine Planning Authority, and we had a regulator governing what we were doing offshore. We had the UK Marine Policy Statement, which was the first real kind of guidance on kind of what the expectations were from the government for assessments offshore, and that this is all fed into a series of regional marine plans around our coast, which provide those spatial policies and specific policies for conserving marine archaeology and seascapes offshore. And at the same time, we have this emerging series of guidance, which Dan covered earlier, so I won't go into all of it again, but just to sort of say that sort of we A fundamental early one for GeoArc came from the Cowrie guidance on offshore geotechnical investigations, which was the first real detailed main guidance which came out and showed how we could use marine geotechnical investigations undertaken for engineering and design purposes for geoarchaeological purposes. And that kind of almost became a bit of a Bible and still is really. I was interested, you say, Dan, about do we need marine GeoArc guidance offshore? And maybe it's time that we probably looked at this again, because we're still effectively using this document published in 2011 as our main piece of guidance for offshore GeoArc. It's also good to say, though, that the recently updated and reissued environmental archaeology, we were guidance from Historic England, we were very pleased to see that there was a offshore example in there as a case study. So the example of the Norfolk project was included as a case study, which kind of shows you how much more aware we're becoming of marine GeoArc these days. And if we move on 10 years from 2006, well, it's actually 2017, but I think that will do. But looking at this example of the Norfolk projects, so 10 years down the line, we now have an archaeological technical report, which is 416 pages long. And this does include all the gazetteers and the figures and everything, but this is a lot more than 52 pages. We have 2 areas covered in this assessment, which are 89 kilometres and 45 kilometres off the Norfolk coast. So we're not talking near shore anymore. This is way offshore. We've got detailed paleolandscape assessment using the geophysical data. We had significant geotechnical data across the areas, and we've got 65 geotechnical sampling locations which we were able to use for the geoarchaeological assessment. And in this report, there was 15 pages on seabed prehistory, which doesn't perhaps sound that much more than the 6 that were in 2006, but this was supported by 4 appendices detailing the results of the stages 1, 2, 3, and 4 geoarchaeological assessment. So for this project, which was made it quite unusual, this is one of the few projects where we actually had all those stages of geoarchaeological assessment done at the time that the EIA was submitted and we were going through examination. And this was all just to support EIA. So it didn't stop there. But before I kind of go on to that a little bit more, I want to come back to this question of kind of, where are the people? GeoArc does have a purpose. It does have a point. I know this because I work with it all the time and it's fundamental to the work that I do. But where are the people in all of this? I asked AI where all the people was, and it wasn't as good as what Dan gave it, probably because I didn't give it enough information. But apart from the technical, obviously, inaccuracies in that picture, I do quite like that image. So I decided to include it anyway. But what do I mean by where are the people? What the questions that I'm asking is, that's a good point. How does it work when you've got an animation thing? You just click on there. Can you have an impact, an environmental impact on a geological formation or a paleolandscape feature? Would it matter if you did? Would this be a significant effect? Like, if we put a wind turbine through a geological formation, who cares? Does it matter? How do we assess that? These are all just questions for discussion, not like, I'm not putting across a point, by the way. But are features and deposits and ecofacts, are they EIA receptors in the same way as sites and artifacts are? Because we don't really treat them like that. We don't treat a paleoenvironmental remain in the same way that we would treat a stone tool when we're talking about environmental impacts to cultural heritage offshore. So do they count as heritage assets? Or is marine geoarchaeology just one of these suite of tools that we're using to try and find the people offshore? And if so, if it's mitigation, what are we mitigating? What are we actually looking for? Now, the reason I've asked these questions here is not to provide answers to these questions here, but it's really the whole point of, I guess, this network is these are the things that we're all talking about now. These are the questions that are really important to our industry and kind of what we do next with it. And so these are questions that we have arguments about on a daily basis. So it would be great to start to explore these topics and get people's views on these as we kind of move further into kind of these kind of sessions. One of the things I wanted to sort of say is, looking at this slide, is if we're talking about mitigation and geoarchaeology as mitigation, one of the things we kind of sort of do is we use geoarchaeology as a means of investigating and mitigating in the marine environment at the same time, because we're quite restricted in what we can do. So in planning these geotechnical investigations, we can have an input. And in terms of kind of how we might use that to investigate from a geoarchaeological perspective, we can input into that planning process, and we can try and guide where the locations are to basically sort of say, will these locations and samples be any use to us in helping us find where the archaeology is? And will they be enough for us to understand the impact that we need to mitigate? And once we've had that button put into planning and we've got the logs through, as part of that stage 1 review, we're effectively, through investigating something, we're looking for the deposits which could help us find the archaeology. But from a mitigation point of view, this is more kind of like, I think of it as the marine equivalent of trial trenching. It's more like an evaluation technique. It's not so much of a mitigation at that point. So in recording them at that stage 2 level, we're looking at whether or not these deposits will help us find the archaeology. And at the same time, are these deposits suitable for providing mitigation? And then as we move through stage 3 and stage 4, we're kind of looking much more at, well, what do these paleoenvironmental remains tell us about where people were living? What environments and what the physical landscapes were the people living in, or could they have been living in? But at the same time, we're also using this information to say, how far can we mitigate our impacts to this that we don't know what they are or where they are? How can we use this information to mitigate? And that is effectively what is the expected contribution to knowledge and understanding? The mitigation is that increase in knowledge. So by the time we're saying what kind of environments they might have been living in, that's the mitigation, the contribution to knowledge and understanding. And when we get to stage 5, when we're looking at publication, from an investigation point of view, this is great. We've got peer-reviewed results. This is feeding back into industry. But this is how we're realising the mitigation. But my question kind of is, well, what comes next? This is what we've been doing for a number of years, is using GeoArc as a suite of kind of means of investigating and mitigating impacts to submerged prehistory. But is that where it ends? And I think if we look at kind of where we are today, so 2026, if we look again at this sort of model of EIA for offshore wind farms, where do we go from here? So more recently, we've kind of been working within industry to extend the scope of the studies that we're doing. So rather than looking at project scale, we've been encouraging developers independently or where it's possible to work collaboratively together to look at much larger areas so we can combine and investigate a much wider character of landscape across these areas. And 2 particular examples is the Norfolk project for Vanguard East, West and Boreas. The example of Norfolk Vanguard I used earlier, this is what's coming next for that, is Wessex Archaeology have been doing a suite of kind of geoarchaeology and geophysical assessments. So it's in performing this kind of paleo landscape study of this very, very wide area. And the same for the Dogger Bank projects. So with Dogger Bank A, B, C, and now D, and also Sophia as well as being the other project that sits within that zone. And that's the zone that you can see the landscape mapping there for. It's looking at these areas across a much wider area. What is this telling us? These are still in progress. Publication should be out next year. So hopefully we should be in a position where we're getting more peer-reviewed input and we can start to kind of understand the role and the utility of these much better. But the other flip side of it as well is kind of how can we use all of this data to actually do predictive modelling and undertake sampling and find archaeology. So this has been the premise of the Taking at the Flood project, which has been ongoing and remains ongoing at the moment. It's basically, how can we use this data to kind of target areas of the seabed to actually find archaeology, with some success, which is good to see, but it's a model now that we can sort of test and move forward with. But I've also put in there, this takes us full circle back to where we started at the ALSF, the seabed prehistory work that Wessex was doing. This was fundamentally where we started. Why is it taking us 20 years to get to the point where we're now using these techniques to try and find the archaeology again? But maybe it is just that it's taken us this long to catch up in terms of techniques and the techniques that are available to us, but largely as well is it to do with how the industry and the tools available to us, but also specialists working with that. So as I said at the start, and I do sorry if I've talked at you quite quickly, but as I said at the start, this is presentation isn't about answers, it's about asking questions that hopefully we'll get an opportunity to discuss and explore further through this network, and really welcome anybody's thoughts or opinions on anything that Dan said or anything that I've said. And I think we've got 10 minutes left for questions if I stop talking.